And welcome to The Untold Past. Today we're going to be doing something completely different. We're going to be ranking the kings and queens of England from 1066 all the way to the modern day. To do this we're going to be using Tiermaker, and you can see we have 5 different tiers up here. You can see we've got Crown and Glory, we've got High Tier, Mid Tier, Low Tier and Dungeon. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be ranking each king and queen in terms of their historical importance, how interesting they are, their reputation, and also how important they are still to England today. An example of this is Henry VIII, and the amount of tourism he brings into England would probably see him towards the top of this list. As always, if you do enjoy our videos, please make sure to support the channel by subscribing. If you do hear any pages turning, that's just me looking at my notes while we're going through this. It's took a while to prepare. However, let's get started, shall we? Okay, the king that begins this list is William the Conqueror in 1066. Now, he reigned until 1087, and one of his most famous moments was defeating Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. His successful invasion was backed up by the fact he was a very effective leader. The biggest threat to his reign was the fact that he had to deal with many different revolts, and he did this in a very, very extreme and brutal way. He committed the harrying of the North. He did this because in the North they believed in the Danelaw and supported the Vikings. Now, with this list, it is going to be quite controversial, and hopefully you can get involved a little bit of this in the comments. In my opinion, William is probably towards the top end of this list. He changed religion massively, bringing in new churches. He ordered the Domesday Book. He created motte-and-bailey castles, and which stone-keep castles are there today. However, one of the biggest arguments against William is the fact he can be seen to be too brutal. And also, he had a slight bit of nepotism with rewarding his generals with land. Because of his importance in terms of historical value, I'm probably going to place him at the top at Crown and Glory. He is known to be one of the most famous kings of England. Second of all, we have William II, his son. Now, William II was known as William Rufus, and he reigned from 1087 to 1100. He was quite effective. He did put down revolts of Bishop Odo and defeated his brother Robert Curthouse to stake his claim in Normandy. He also went on crusade and also defeated the Scots heavily. He didn't really get on with the church. However, what he also did is he seized estates from the important churchmen. Now, he died also mysteriously while hunting. He didn't really carry on the legacy that his father had actually left for him. In terms of history, he hasn't really gone down as a great king. So what we're going to do with William Rufus is actually place him in the mid-tier. He didn't have too much of a great legacy. However, he wasn't too offensive to the population. So I think mid-tier is probably best for him. Next up, we have Henry I. He reigned from 1100 to 1135. In 1101, he reached a settlement with his brother Robert not to go to war. He then married Edith, the sister of the King of Scotland, to secure his power a little bit. He developed the exchequer to look after the royal money as well. Now, as a king, one of the negatives about Henry was the fact he was frequently absent, and in fact he died in a shipwreck. Very similarly to the previous king, William II, he didn't really have too much of a legacy here. Marrying the King of Scotland's sister was an extremely smart move really to help secure him more power in Scotland, who at the time it was extremely volatile there. For this, we're probably going to put him back in the mid-tier again. Okay, next up we have King Stephen. King Stephen reigned in 1135 to 1154. Much of King Stephen's reign is defined by civil war, and in fact seeing off Matilda. He did go into a civil war with Matilda, and he wasn't really a natural leader and was extremely easily manipulated. He appointed lots of earls around him, and this was a very expensive thing to do. However, eventually he did see off the threat from Matilda, which was sort of a success. What we're actually going to do is we're going to put Stephen in a low tier. He didn't have too great a legacy and isn't massively seen today as a king of much historical importance. Next up we have Henry II. Henry II reigned from 1154 to 1189. Now, he secured his succession following Stephen's death quite spectacularly. He reorganised the judicial system and brought in courts and the prisons and established the English presence in Ireland. All these things can be seen as quite a positive thing for England. One of the biggest moments which Henry is remembered for is the murder of his good friend Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket was killed in extremely brutal fashion, and much of this case and the murder hinges on what Henry II actually said to his knights. He allegedly said to his knights, "Will no one rid me of this priest?" The knights then decided to ride down to the cathedral in which Becket was and decided to murder him quite brutally. Following this, the cathedral became a site of pilgrimage and Becket today is still remembered. Henry decided to take a lot of punishment for this event. He decided to be whipped by monks as a way of apologising to God. Also, a lot of serious family disputes hampered his later reign, especially with his sons. Henry II, although has some good points, the murder of Thomas Becket was an extremely controversial thing and an extremely brutal thing for his reign to be remembered of. For this, we're going to possibly put him in the low tier here. An extremely brutal event which would not have happened should Henry have not stated those words, "Will no one rid me of this priest?" Okay, so we're now on to Richard I. Richard I's nickname is Richard the Lionheart. He reigned from 1189 to 1119. He was the third son of Henry II. By the age of 16, he was leading his own army, putting down different rebellions in France. Although he was crowned King of England, he spent most of his reign abroad, preferring to use the taxes from his kingdom to fund various armies and military ventures. He is known for being a crusading king, and found himself at the head of the army in the Third Crusade. He was a leading Christian commander during the Third Crusade, and on his way back from Palestine, Richard was captured and held for ransom. Now, Richard I did come very close to capturing Jerusalem. However, a few negatives are the fact he was unwilling to get married to produce an heir, and the imprisonment and ransom by the German emperor was a serious source of embarrassment for him. In England, he is seen as a very successful king, due to his success in the Third Crusade. In terms of his legacy, we're probably going to place him in the higher tier here. He didn't necessarily produce an heir and so on, which would have greatly impacted history. He was a very successful military commander. For us, he belongs in the high tier. He isn't as notorious as William the Conqueror, though. Now we're on to King John. King John reigned from 1199 to 1216. His reign is known for being one of Britain's worst. A positive of King John's reign is the fact that he improved castle design and also strengthened many of the fortifications in which we still see today. An example of this is Corfe Castle. However, John's reign was plagued by many problems with his barons. Eventually, in 1215, he was made to sign the Magna Carta. He was seen as a bad king, and this was forced upon him due to the fact that he taxed people extremely heavily. He also before plotted against Richard I. So John's reputation as being one of England's worst kings can't really be disputed here. For that, he goes in our dungeon, the lowest category. He was extremely unpopular with the people, and his legacy today still stands with the fact that the Magna Carta, which limits the power of the king, is referenced in the Declaration of Independence. Now, the next king we're on to is Henry III. Henry III had an extremely long reign for a king at the time. He reigned from 1216 to 1272. He managed to defeat Simon de Montfort with his son Prince Edward, and Simon de Montfort would cause him many problems with the barons, especially when his sister married him. De Montfort would try and claim the throne also. He resolved many of the problems following the rebellions of King John. Henry also rebuilt Westminster Abbey in a Gothic style that you can see today. His kingship was definitely marred by problems with his barons. Another negative of Henry's reign was the fact that he was defeated in Wales, and he had many problems with the papacy. He did plunge the country into civil war due to his disputes with de Montfort. At one time, de Montfort even set up a new government. During his disputes with de Montfort also, he was also captured, which shows him to be quite weak, and he was eventually forced to set up a parliament at Westminster, the start of the House of Commons, which has left an extremely long legacy. In terms of his reign, he isn't very well known. Now, in terms of where we're going to place him on our list, we're probably going to go low tier here. The importance of the House of Commons doesn't outweigh the fact that Henry was actually a rather poor king, even though he did reign for an extremely long time. We are now looking at Edward I. Edward I reigned from 1272 to 1307. He was also known as Edward Longshanks. He was a statesman, a lawyer, and a soldier. He formed the Model Parliament in 1295, bringing the knights, the clergy and nobility, as well as the lords and commons together for the first time. He aimed for a united Britain, and he defeated the Welsh chieftains and created his eldest son, the Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales is a tradition and a title that's still held today. In terms of his success as a king, he escaped Simon de Montfort, who was previously at war with his dad, and then also defeated him at the Battle of Evesham. He invaded and defeated the Welsh, which was extremely important, and built many castles there to enforce his rule. The Prince of Wales ceremony is extremely important still today, and Prince Charles is still today known as the Prince of Wales for us. He also managed to invade and conquer Scotland. However, one huge negative of Edward's rule was the expulsion of the Jews in 1290. This shows that Britain suffered from early anti-Semitism. In terms of where Edward I is on our list, we're probably going to place him in the mid-tier. Now we're on to Edward II. Edward II reigned from 1307 and was deposed in 1327. Edward had many different favourites, including the infamous Piers Gaveston. In battle, he was beaten by the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. His defeat for Robert the Bruce wasn't his only problem. He was overthrown by his wife Isabella of France in favour of their son. As a king, Edward leaves really no legacy, and as he was an extremely poor king, he definitely deserves to go in our dungeon along with King John. Edward III was a king between 1327 and 1377. He was a son of Edward II and reigned for 50 years. He had a great ambition to conquer Scotland and France and plunged England into the 100 Years' War, which began in 1338. He had two great victories early on at Crécy and Poitiers, which made Edward and his son the Black Prince the most renowned warriors in Europe. However, one problem that would last throughout the 100 Years' War was the fact that it was extremely expensive. Also, throughout his reign, there was an extremely deadly outbreak of the bubonic plague, the Black Death. This allegedly killed around half of the population. In terms of where we're going to place him on our list, he had an extremely long reign, and the beginning of the 100 Years' War was an extremely positive thing for England. In fact, even the Black Prince captured the French king. A negative of his reign was the fact that he was easily led by his mistress in his final years. Also, he imposed new taxes to pay for the 100 Years' War. In terms of where we're going to place Edward III on our list, we're probably going to place him in the high tier due to the early victories in the 100 Years' War. The son of the Black Prince, Richard II reigned from 1377 and was deposed in 1399. He was rather extravagant, unjust and faithless. In 1381, the Peasants' Revolt came around and was led by a guy called Wat Tyler. The rebellion came at great shock, and in fact, the peasants who were revolting also managed to seize the Tower of London's weapons by raiding the armoury. The rebellion was put down with great severity. Richard originally decided to agree with the peasants about their demands, however quickly backtracked on his words. Richard experienced heartbreak though when his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, died. Because of this, he decided to indulge in extravagance, acts of revenge, and became quite tyrannous, which turned his subjects against him. His advisors were extremely unpopular, and Parliament impeached his Chancellor. He submitted to Parliament's wishes quite regularly. Richard II abdicated when Henry IV invaded. He didn't even give up a fight. In terms of his reign and his legacy, he's mostly known for the Peasants' Revolt. The Peasants' Revolt marred his reign, and also the fact he didn't even put up a fight against Henry IV shows what a poor king he is. For that, I think we're going to place him in the dungeon. As always, if you are enjoying these videos, please support the channel by subscribing. Following Richard II's reign, we're now going to look at Henry IV. Henry IV reigned from 1399 to 1413. He was the son of John of Gaunt, and Henry returned from exile in France to reclaim his estates that were previously seized by Richard II. He was accepted as a king by Parliament, which shows how unpopular Richard II was. Henry spent most of his 13-year reign defending himself against plots, rebellions, and assassination attempts. In Wales, Owen Glendower declared himself the Prince of Wales and led a national uprising against English rule. In England, Henry had great difficulty in maintaining the support of both clergy and also the Parliament. In terms of how successful he was as a king, Henry IV marks a period of time where the House of Lancaster rose to the throne. Seizing power quite easily from Richard II shows him to be quite scary and also quite shrewd. Quashing most of the rebellions also was an extreme success. However, he had to fight off raids along the Scottish borders and the French in the 100 Years' War. He also relied heavily on Parliament grants, which greatly annoyed Parliament. In terms of where we're going to place him on our list, we're going to definitely go for the mid-tier here. As you can see, it's adding up quite well. We've got William the Conqueror sitting in the Crown and Glory, and we've got 3 kings sitting in the dungeon. We're now going to look at Henry V. Henry V is most commonly known for the 100 Years' War and his association with it. He reigned from 1413 to 1422 in a rather short but very influential reign. Henry led the English to victory at Agincourt, even though they were greatly outnumbered. This victory has gone down in history as being one of England's greatest ever victories on a battlefield. He was an extremely great warrior king. He even quashed a conspiracy to put Edmund Mortimer on the throne. He led an extremely successful conquest of Normandy as well, and was even recognised as the heir to the French throne after marrying Catherine, the French king's daughter. Henry V is definitely an extremely influential king. In terms of what he did on the battlefield in such a short reign, we're probably going to put Henry V at the top of our list. We're now going to start looking at the War of the Roses, which was a turbulent time in England's history in the 15th century. The king in question now is Henry VI. He reigned from 1422 to 1461, and then again in 1470 to 1471. He succeeded to the throne at 9 months old and was an extremely pious man. Initially, he had a very long reign. However, he is seen as not being one of England's greatest kings. During his reign, he lost much of the territory in France to Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who led the French army. This led Henry to attract a lot of scrutiny from the English public. He also picked the wrong advisors and there was a power struggle in his court. Due to the loss of territory in France, he suffered a complete nervous breakdown and disappeared for a little bit. During this time, civil war was about to kick off and the War of the Roses was about to begin. Although losing the throne to Edward IV, he would be reinstated to the throne by Warwick Kingmaker, the Earl of Warwick. Henry would then again lose the throne, and eventually was murdered in the Tower of London. One can feel sorry for Henry, due to the fact at the time he inherited not just the throne of England, but the throne of France at a very young age. However, he wasn't a very good king, it's quite clear. For this, we're going to place him in the low tier. Due to the fact that Henry VI was seen as a weak king, Edward IV did seize the throne and defeat Henry. He overthrown the weak Henry and won a number of different battles, including the Battle of Barnet, where Warwick Kingmaker was killed. After 1471, he restored peace in England until 1483. He would use the income from the Crown's estates to pay for his wars. In England, he wasn't very popular. His morals were quite poor and he had many mistresses, and had at least one illegitimate son. Another negative of Edward's reign was the fact that he was defeated actually in 1470, restoring the previous king, Henry VI, back to the throne. In terms of where Edward belongs in our list, it's between mid-tier and high tier. We're going to place him in the high tier actually. Even though he wasn't very popular, he did manage to depose the weak Henry VI. Next up we have Edward V, who reigned, if you can really call it a reign, in 1483. Now, there isn't much positive to Edward's reign, due to the fact that he was murdered in the Tower of London. Contemporary sources say that he was actually seen playing and shooting in the Tower of London Gardens, and then eventually started to disappear from sight. The rumour is that he was murdered by Richard III, or someone who was ordered to do it by Richard III. His reign had no impact on history, however, his death certainly did. This is due to the fact that Richard III would then seize the throne. The implications of Richard's reign would then change England forever. It would probably be rather cruel to put Edward in a dungeon. The most important point about Edward's reign was what happened after. For this, we're going to place him in the low tier. Richard III reigned between 1483 and 1485. He was a brother of Edward IV. In history, he is known to be quite notorious, and Shakespeare portrays him as quite a villainous figure with a hunchback. He rose to power under very mysterious circumstances, allegedly with the murder of Edward V. The murder of Edward V and his brother is known today as the Prince in the Tower mystery, and today remains unsolved. The murders of his nephews made his rule very unpopular. In 1485, Henry Richmond, who was a descendant of John of Gaunt, the father of Henry IV, landed in West Wales and gathered forces as he marched into England. Henry Tudor, as is more commonly known, met Richard at the Battle of Bosworth. The Battle of Bosworth didn't end very well for Richard, and even ended in his death. Today he is known as one of England's most notorious kings, and was known as a clever schemer. He even declared Edward IV's marriage bigamous and illegitimate, making him the natural heir and successor. He also is known for the brutal murder of William Hastings. He can also be tied to the murder of Henry VI. His great loss at the Battle of Bosworth ushered in the Tudor reign, one of England's most infamous and most famous. In terms of how important Richard is to the story of the nation, he probably belongs at the top of this list. In terms of how successful a king he was, he probably belongs towards the bottom end of our list. With his more recent discovery of his remains in a car park in Leicester, and how important that was to Leicester as a city, we're probably going to place Richard III in terms of how famous he is in the high tier. His reputation remains still an extremely negative one, and today, the story of the Prince in the Tower still captivates tourists that visit the Tower of London. Next up we have Henry Tudor, or Henry VII. Henry VII reigned from 1485 to 1509, and is known to be the first Tudor monarch. He defeated Richard III at Bosworth, and united the two sides of the War of the Roses. He did this by marrying Elizabeth of York. Throughout his reign, he put down many different revolts, including that of the Great Pretender, Perkin Warbeck. Throughout his reign, the royal income rose greatly, and he was very shrewd with money. The only negative we can probably think of Henry VII is the fact that he had a very flimsy and weak claim to the throne. In terms of his importance to the nation and to England, he definitely belongs towards the higher end of our list, being the man who ushered in the Tudor era. The Tudor era would then see England's most famous kings and queens rise to the throne. In terms of where we're going to put Henry VII on our list, we're definitely going to place him in the crowning glory section, towards the top end of our list. England's most famous king, undoubtedly, is Henry VIII. Every year, tourists flock to England to find out about Henry VIII and his 6 wives, and also the story of his reign. He reigned from 1509 to 1547. One of his greatest legacies was the Reformation, in which saw Henry become the leader of the Church of England. His reign is also marred with tension and war with Spain, and tension between other parts of the world, including the Holy Roman Emperor. He was also awarded the Defender of the Faith title by the papacy early on in his reign. As a younger man, he was also a great athlete and very clever. Henry VIII is definitely most famous for his 6 wives. During his reign, there were many executions, including the murder of his friends. He was eventually excommunicated by the Pope, and the dissolution of the monasteries following the Reformation was extremely brutal. He long sought for a male heir, which left him in debt to previous wives after divorce. He also had the blood of 2 of his wives on his hands. Henry VIII definitely belongs in our crowning glory section at the top of this list. Still today, millions of tourists every year flock to England to find out about the story of Henry VIII. Edward VI had a short reign, reigning from 1547 to 1553, and he was the son of Henry VIII. Throughout his reign, he brought in the English prayer book, and the Act of Uniformity was passed. And he also ushered in a mass change of Protestantism. There were many different changes in the church under Edward. For example, altars became tables. Throughout Edward's reign, he suffered from poor health, and a regency council helped rule for him. He didn't really have much of a say of what was going on in the country due to his age. There were extreme revolts against the prayer book that he brought in, and also England was faced with economic and social injustice. Edward VI would later go on to die young of tuberculosis. In terms of where we're going to place Edward on our list, we're probably going to place him in the low tier, due to the fact he's probably the least influential Tudor monarch. Mary I reigned from 1553 to 1558. Today she has an extremely famous reputation. She is known today as Bloody Mary due to the burnings of Protestants that occurred during her reign. She stood up for her beliefs and returned the country to Catholicism. She began to outlaw Protestantism as well. She overthrew Lady Jane Grey from the throne. In terms of her reputation, Bloody Mary, she burnt over 200 Protestants brutally at the stake. One of the biggest things that Mary was criticised for is for her marriage to Philip II of Spain. Philip was not trusted due to being a Spaniard and also his strong links to Catholicism. During Mary's reign, there was also an unsuccessful war against France, and England lost Calais in 1558. In terms of how important Mary is today, she's an extremely important figure in English history. In terms of where we're going to place Mary I on our list, we're probably going to place her in the mid-tier. This is due to the fact that her reputation today precedes her. At the time, England was plagued by great religious intolerance and instability. One of England's most infamous and famous monarchs is Elizabeth I, who reigned between 1558 and 1603. During her reign, there was a golden age of exploration due to the explorers Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh. Also throughout her reign, there was a boom in theatre and literature, with the creation of theatres such as the Globe. Also during this time, William Shakespeare flourished. Elizabeth is known for being a very headstrong queen, who was married to her country. During her reign, she saw off many different plots, including Mary Queen of Scots. She is known for being extremely intelligent, but also rather ruthless. Her decision not to marry was very popular, especially after Philip II and Mary I. In England, she was an extremely popular queen. However, during her reign, the poor became much poorer, and also the fact she didn't produce an heir ended the Tudor era forever. During her reign, she managed to return England to Protestantism and was rather more lenient of acts of heresy than her sister was. In terms of where we're going to place Elizabeth on our list, she definitely belongs in the crowning glory section due to her legacy. Next, we have the first Stuart monarch, James I. James was the son of Mary Queen of Scots. He was the first king to rule over Scotland and England. James was more of a scholar than a man of action. James was seen as a shrewd ruler who controlled different religions and political groups in Scotland before taking control of England. He was allied with Elizabeth, even when his mother was executed. After Elizabeth's death, there was a smooth transition of power to James I. Also in his reign, there was a new version of the Bible that became popular and was used for 250 years. He also tried to encourage European peace and ended a war with Spain. A negative of James's rule was the Gunpowder Plot. This was a plot to blow up Parliament and the King after the ill treatment of Catholics in the country. This event is extremely famous in England and is celebrated every November the 5th. In terms of where we're going to place James on our list, we're probably going to place him in the high tier. His legacy lives on due to the Gunpowder Plot and also the fact that he was the first ruler of England and also Scotland. Our next king is Charles I, who reigned from 1625 to 1649. Much has been said about Charles I and his reign, mostly negative however. During his reign, England was plunged into civil war. During his reign, he kept dissolving Parliament to rule alone, and he forced new prayer books on the Scots, which greatly upset them. He would also keep raising taxes. His reign saw the rise of Cromwell, and eventually civil war took place, of which Charles then lost this. He was then executed by Cromwell on behalf of the people in Whitehall in London. The execution of Charles I is an extremely infamous event. In terms of how successful a king he was, he definitely belongs in our dungeon with the likes of King John. To be executed by your own people shows really how successful your reign was. Next we're going to look at Charles II, who reigned from 1660 to 1685 during the restoration of the monarchy. Following the death of Oliver Cromwell and the fall of the Protectorate, Parliament asked Charles to take the throne. Although he was very popular, he was a rather weak king, and his foreign policy was completely inept. He was known to have 13 different mistresses. Before being king, he did deal with the Scots and proclaimed himself king. He tried to invade England but was eventually defeated by Cromwell. Charles II as a king was extremely tolerant of religions. Under his reign we saw a rise of trade with India, the East Indies and America. He also funded the Royal Society. During his reign in 1665, the Great Plague occurred and also the Great Fire of London in 1666. He also lost a war with the Dutch. During this reign, he would find himself in conflict with Parliament and would also dissolve Parliament, much like Charles I did. In terms of where we're going to place him on our list, Charles II belongs in the mid-tier. The restoration of the monarchy was extremely important to England, however his reign wasn't completely successful. Next up we have James II, who reigned from 1685 to 1688. In England he was known as an accomplished Royal Navy commander, and he crushed rebellions by Charles II's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth. He also, throughout his reign, promoted religious tolerance. On the flip side, he was regularly in conflict with Parliament and prorogued and ruled alone for a while. He also promoted Catholicism, which greatly annoyed a number of people in the country. One of the most negative parts of his reign, though, is the invasion of William of Orange. During this time, the navy and army completely deserted James II, and he fled abroad. He was also defeated at the Battle of Boyne in 1660 against William. In terms of where James II belongs on our list, we're going to place him in the low tier. He wasn't the greatest king, however was more a rather successful Royal Navy commander. Next up we see the only dual reigning king and queen in our list. This next pair is William III and Mary II. On the 5th of November 1688, William of Orange sailed his fleet of over 450 ships, unopposed by the Royal Navy, into Torbay Harbour and landed his troops in Devon. When landing, he gathered much local support and marched an army of around 20,000 strong to London in the Glorious Revolution. William would go on to defeat James II. During his reign, he founded the Bank of England in 1694. He also ended war with Flanders and was greatly supported by Parliament. The fact his reign is known as the Glorious Revolution is due to the fact there was not much bloodshed in England and the transition of power was relatively smooth. Also, during this time, there was a shift towards a constitutional monarchy. He also freed the colonies of anti-Puritan laws. However, on the flip side, there was bloodshed in Scotland, and also the revolution caused many uprisings in America. In terms of where William and Mary sit on our list, we're probably going to place them in the high tier. The Glorious Revolution is an extremely important and profound event in English history. Our next queen on the list is Queen Anne, who reigned from 1702 to 1714. Anne was the second daughter of James II. She had 17 pregnancies, but only one child survived, William, who died of smallpox aged just 11. She was a staunch Protestant and was 37 when she succeeded to the throne. During her reign, The unification of England and Scotland was made, and Anne became the first sovereign of Great Britain. Negatively, she was heavily influenced by her advisors, and would become the final Stuart monarch. During her reign, England gained an influence never before attained in Europe, due to the fact that the Duke of Marlborough managed to win a series of major battles in the War of Spanish Succession. In terms of how influential Anne was as a monarch, she either belongs in the high tier or the mid tier. The high tier argument is due to the fact that she became the first sovereign of Great Britain. The mid tier argument is due to the fact that during her reign, she was heavily influenced by her advisors and did not have much impact in the country. We're going to sit more conservatively on this one and place her in the mid tier. Next up we have George I, the first Hanoverian. George reigned between 1714 and 1727. He put down a rebellion by the Jacobites who supported James Stuart in 1715 at the start of his reign. He also led an anti-Spanish alliance with France. The 54-year-old George arrived in England and was only able to speak a few words of English, and he arrived with his 18 cooks and 2 mistresses. Throughout his reign, George never learned English, so the conduct of national policy was left to the government. During this time, Sir Robert Walpole became Britain's first Prime Minister. He didn't have the strongest claim to the throne, and due to the fact he couldn't speak much English, the public were not massively fans. Also, throughout his reign, there was a collapse of the South Sea Company in 1720, where lots of government and royal investment was lost, causing an economic crisis, which led to even more unpopular feeling towards George. George's reign also indicates a decline of political power of the monarchy and the rise of the Prime Minister. In terms of how important George was, we're probably going to place him in the low tier. His inability to speak English left him extremely unpopular. George II was the only son of George I and reigned between 1727 and 1760. He was more English than his father, but still relied on Sir Robert Walpole to run the country for him. George was the last English king to lead his army into battle in 1743. In 1745, the Jacobites tried once again to restore a Stuart to the monarch. Also during his reign, Bonnie Prince Charlie landed in Scotland, and he was routed at Culloden Moor. During George's reign, there was much expansion in India and Canada. However, he had an extremely poor relationship with his father. He also then argued with his son, the Prince of Wales, who then led an anti-administration faction. George II was extremely disinterested in politics, and his involvement in the 7 Years' War was overseen by William Pitt. George II was a rather passive king. In terms of where George II sits on our list, he probably belongs in the low tier with his father. We're now on to George III, who reigned from 1760 to 1820. As English was his first language, he was more popular than his grandfather and also his father. He also led a happy marriage and had 15 children. During his reign, he appointed William Pitt, who was a skilled leader and went to war with France. During George's reign, there was a boom in literature, with writers such as Jane Austen, Byron and Shelley featuring throughout his reign. In terms of his reign, he chose poor ministers, like the Earl of Bute, who isolated George. The Crown during this time was also in much financial difficulty, and he raised taxes in America, and the War of Independence began, which Britain lost in 1781. The War of Independence had a great strain on him and put massive pressure on the monarchy. In terms of where George III sits on our list, he goes in the low tier with his grandfather and also his father. Now we're looking at George IV. George IV reigned from 1820 to 1830. He had a love of art and architecture, but his private life was an extreme mess. He was married twice, once in 1785 to Mrs. Fitzherbert secretly, as she was a Catholic, and then was married again in 1795 to Caroline of Brunswick. Mrs. Fitzherbert remained the love of his life, and Caroline and George had one daughter, Charlotte, who was born in 1796 but died in 1817. George was considered a great wit, but was also considered a buffoon. He was a great artistic patron who collected lots of art and encouraged architecture. He also developed the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. He had a poor relationship with his father due to his lavish lifestyle. His secret marriages also were extremely unpopular. For this, we're going to place him in the dungeon. You cannot simply have a king or queen who has no interest in politics or government. We're now looking at William IV, who reigned from 1830 to 1837. William IV was known as a sailor king, and he served at sea in America and the West Indies before becoming an admiral. Initially, he was very popular and he insisted on a simple coronation, not a lavish one like the kings before him. He also introduced the Reform Act that stopped abuses on the electoral systems. However, the Reform Act took a long while to pass. There was a reform crisis in his reign, and the Duke of Wellington's Tory government lost the election to the Whigs. This plunged the whole of the country into a political crisis, and riots broke out during the winter of 1831. In terms of where William belongs on our list, he belongs in the low tier. Next up we have the infamous Queen Victoria, who had an extremely long reign from 1837 to 1901. The throne that Victoria inherited was weak and unpopular. Her Hanoverian uncles had been not treated well, and they weren't thought of well by the public. In 1840 she married her cousin Albert. Albert exerted a lot of influence over his queen, and until his death could be considered the actual ruler of the country during Victoria's reign. During her reign, Buckingham Palace was made a royal residence, of which it still remains today. She became the richest woman in the world and survived an assassination attempt. She had 9 children with her husband, who these children would later go on to be rather famous and influential, for example Tsar Nicholas of Russia. She also managed to reach a golden jubilee. She began new parliamentary traditions. She also was a patron to many different charities and museums. Under her reign, the Victoria Cross was established, Britain's highest military medal. She also became the Empress of India. One negative of Victoria's reign was her botched coronation, where her ring was placed on the wrong finger and took over an hour to remove. Also, she was seen as rather unconstitutional. When the Whig government fell, she refused to appoint a Tory Prime Minister in Robert Peel. Also, she was rather depressive over the mourning of Albert. In terms of where Victoria sits on our list, we're going to place her in the high tier. This is due to the fact that she had extremely influential children that would go to war in the First World War. Also, during her reign, Britain was plunged into great change. We're now going to look at Edward VII, who reigned from 1901 to 1910. Edward's reign restored the sparkle to the monarchy following Prince Albert's death and Queen Victoria's depression. He was related to European rulers, which helped negotiate diplomacy across Europe. He also founded the Order of Merit. In terms of negatives, Queen Victoria blamed him for the death of his father, and he spent much time gambling and drinking and became very popular in London society. This lifestyle led him to have many mistresses and relationships with actresses. At the end of his reign, it was marred by constitutional crisis in Parliament. In terms of where Edward belongs on our list, we're going to place him in the low tier. Edward didn't really have a great influence in England, and his lifestyle was rather negative. George V reigned from 1910 to 1936. George had not expected to be king, but when his elder brother died, he became the heir apparent. He joined the Navy as a cadet in 1877 and loved being at sea. In 1893, he married Princess Mary of Teck, his dead brother's fiancée. His years on the throne were difficult, especially when the First World War broke out, and also there were troubles in Ireland, which led to the creation of the Irish Free State. During the First World War, George would visit the front line regularly and became extremely popular. His Silver Jubilee was celebrated throughout Britain. The anti-German sentiment during the First World War meant that he adopted the surname Windsor. The victory of the First World War and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles was definitely a positive of George's reign. However, there was an economic slump caused by the National Coalition of Government. In terms of where he ranks on our list, George V probably sits in the mid-tier. Although he could be higher because of his efforts in the First World War, problems in Ireland definitely plagued him. Edward VIII had an extremely short reign in 1936. He reigned from June to December of 1936. Initially, he was very popular and visited areas of Britain of high unemployment. Throughout his reign he had many affairs and fell in love with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. As the head of the Church of England, this was extremely unpopular in England and Britain. The public decided that he shouldn't marry a divorced woman. Eventually he abdicated in December 1936, becoming the only sovereign in England and Britain to abdicate voluntarily. He also later on had an association with Hitler and the Nazis. If it wasn't for his abdication, our queen at the moment would currently not be queen. However, his reign was extremely insignificant and rather a mess. In terms of where Edward VIII sits in our list, he definitely belongs in the dungeon. Our penultimate monarch to look at is George VI. George VI reigned from 1936 to 1952 and was an extremely popular king. He was a rather shy and unassuming man who did not expect to become the monarch. During the Second World War, he remained at Buckingham Palace during the Blitz and visited soldiers on the front line and also visited many battleships and boats. He is also known for his stammer, which made him rather endearing to the British public. However, he did have a fear of public speaking, which made it hard for him to carry out his public duties. During his reign, the British Empire declined following Indian independence. He was also an extremely heavy smoker and died from smoking-related illnesses. In terms of what George VI oversaw, i.e. the Second World War, this probably puts him towards the top end of our list, and we're going to place him in the high tier. His story of overcoming a public stammer is rather inspiring. Our final monarch to consider is Elizabeth II, who has reigned from 1952 and is currently still very, very popular. She now has the longest reign of any queen or king in England. During her reign, she's shown support for interfaith relationships and also has led to the decolonisation of many different countries. In the 60s and 70s, many of these countries declared independence and gained their independence. She is also now the patron of over 600 charities. In terms of negatives, she experienced a lot of criticism following the death of Princess Diana. Also, recently, she has experienced a lot of problems with Brexit and the idea of proroguing Parliament. In Britain also, there is a small amount of people who have an anti-monarchy or republican sentiment. In 1992, she declared a horrible year. This is due to reports of strained marriages and affairs within her family. In terms of where we place Elizabeth on our list, she belongs at the top in crowning glory. She has had an extremely long reign and is still extremely popular today. If you have enjoyed these videos, please support the channel by subscribing. We are going to do a few more of these in where we discuss World War II tanks, aircraft and also different battles. To support the channel, please once again subscribe and also like this video. Have a lovely day and thanks for watching.